Hello all. My last lecture in week 7 is going to be on Black Power. As I said, my last two lectures will probably be some of the more controversial ones that I give. I know that people often think of the civil rights movement as divided into a nonviolent and violent section, and there's no doubt that the movement is not always nonviolent. But usually, what that takes on is actually an argument for self defense as opposed to an argument for violence. They're not quite the same thing. Like many of the subjects we're discussing in our class, they're complicated, and I'm just giving an overview. If this is a subject that you'd be more interested in, I can also recommend some books that you can read that would give you a little more in depth on some of these topics. Okay, so the first concept I'm going to talk about is self defense. Self defense, like I've said, it's not an argument for violence, it's an argument for armed resistance. Well, for resistance, usually armed. And basically, it's an argument that says, we have a right to defend ourselves per the Second Amendment right. And if people are going to come into our homes, hurt us and our families, that we have a right to stop that. So a group called the Deacons for Justice were one of these self-defense groups. They started July 10th of 1964. They're founded in Jonesboro, Louisiana by Ernest Chilly Willie Thomas, Frederick Douglass Kirkpatrick. The goal was to protect members of the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, against KKK violence. Most were veterans of World War II or the Vietnam War. Eventually, 3 chapters in Louisiana. Bogalusa, Louisiana chapter had a confrontation that was central in getting the federal government to help African Americans locally with white supremacy violence. They provided security for some of the nonviolent protests to protect the protesters. And another thing that they did was they provided armed resistance for voters trying to register to vote or trying to participate in elections that were being held back or intimidated. And the reality was that many civil rights activists carried guns during the civil rights movement for protection of themselves and others, including Martin Luther King, who applied for a gun permit after his home was bombed. He was refused that gun permit, but most biographers have talked about the fact that he was not against protecting his family and loved ones with a gun. So nonviolent protest and self-defense don't always have to be in opposition. Many historians are now starting to argue that guns and self-defense have been a way of life since the Civil War for African Americans. We talked a little bit about the nadir of race relations, which happened from after the Civil War to the early part of the 20th century, where there are lynchings and extreme violence. And African Americans did protect themselves. So often we talk about the horrible things that happen to them, and we treat them as victims, but they're also advocates for their own civil rights. They're advocates for their own safety. People did not see an inherent conflict in nonviolence and self-defense. One idea is that people have this idea as kind of nonviolence as this peaceful, sedate almost movement, and that's not the reality. Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee starts out as a nonviolent. Now they do become more self-defense organized, but in the beginning they're very much about nonviolent protest. But they're probably one of the most radical organizations within the civil rights movement, just in the way they push boundaries and the way they protest, and that these ideas were extremely radical. So the next I'm going to talk about is Malcolm X, because the focus of this is Black Power. And Malcolm X is probably one of the most famous ideas of Black Power, although I would argue he was more arguing for Black nationalism around. Born Malcolm Little in Omaha, Nebraska in 1925, the 4th child of Earl and Louise Little's 7 children. His father was a Baptist minister and a follower of Marcus Garvey. So just for some of you, because clearly we didn't get a chance to talk about Marcus Garvey. As I've said, there's a lot of history we cover in this class, pretty much from the founding of our country to almost the present day. Um, we don't get to discuss every topic that I'd like to discuss. And Marcus Garvey was a black nationalist supporter. He argued for Pan-Africanism. He is not the first. Some people say W.E.B. Du Bois also argued for Pan-Africanism, and it was the idea that people of African descent across international borders had things in common and had shared a struggle and should unite in that struggle. The idea that African Americans and African Jamaicans and people who were of African descent and lived in England, people who still lived in Africa, that they all shared this common goal. It's often called Pan-Africanism, or sometimes called Black nationalism. And he served as the Omaha chapter president of Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association. And then Lewis Little, his wife, served as the division secretary. From the time that Malcolm was young, he faced a lot of issues of growing racism, including having his house burned to the ground. Although his father's death was ruled an accident, Malcolm always believed that he was killed by the KKK. In 1938, his mother was sent to the Kalamazoo State Mental Hospital. The little children were sent to various foster homes, and Malcolm was sent to a juvenile home because he had been kicked out of school in the 7th grade. He ends up in Mason, Michigan. He did well in the 8th grade. He earned straight A's and was elected president of his 8th grade class. And this is actually a picture up here in the corner is of his class, and you can see that there was not a really racially diverse environment. But unfortunately, he expressed to his teacher that he wanted to be a lawyer, and at the time, his teacher used some really derogatory racial language and basically told him that a black man couldn't be a lawyer in this country. And that was pretty crushing for Malcolm. So in 1941, in February, Ella Collins gained custody of Malcolm. It was his aunt, and he moves to Boston. Over the next few years, he works a number of odd jobs in the railroad, restaurants, and bars, at shoe sign stands and in jewelry stores. Malcolm learns to dress like a hipster, dyes his hair, and starts hustling in Boston, where he's known as New York Red. New York, where his nickname is Detroit Red or Detroit. He continues stealing, hustling, and doing odd jobs until February of 1946. He's sent to jail in Charlestown, Massachusetts. Assigned prisoner number 22843, and he'll remain behind bars until 1952. He's transferred twice, and he ends up in the Norfolk prison colony. Another prisoner convinces him to start studying and enhancing his mind. Malcolm's siblings, 4 of whom have already converted to the Nation of Islam, introduce him to the Nation of Islam. Eventually, he starts corresponding with Elijah Muhammad, and Malcolm continues his course of study, eventually writing to the Massachusetts state governor and demanding the right to practice Islam in prison. He joins the prison debate team and begins attracting attention for his oratory skills. In 1952, Malcolm is released on parole. He goes to Detroit to live with his brother, Wilfred. He quickly joins the Nation of Islam and attends meetings at Detroit Temple Number 1, one of the 4 temples that the nation operates at the time. He becomes known as Malcolm X, rejecting Little, and he also begins an intensive recruiting campaign because he felt like the Nation of Islam was not actively enough recruiting. So Malcolm X marries his first wife and has his first child. He continues to work with the Nation of Islam. He comes up with a newspaper for them called Muhammad Speaks to promote So Malcolm X marries and has his first child. He continues to work with the Nation of Islam. He comes up with a paper, Muhammad Speaks, to promote the Nation of Islam's message. Malcolm continues to work with the Nation of Islam and Elijah Muhammad, although there is a growing rift for many reasons, some of which Malcolm X was, like Martin Luther King, extremely charming and well-spoken, and part of it was jealousy. Malcolm did not approve of everything that Elijah Muhammad was doing, did not always think he was in keeping with his own teachings, so there was a lot of conflict that grows throughout Malcolm X's short life. In 1964, he gives the famous speech, Ballot or the Bullet. And I think this is probably one of his most famous and most often misread speeches. And I highly suggest, if you've never read it, the citation is at the end of this PowerPoint presentation. But I'm just going to quote a tiny bit from it. I believe in action on all fronts by whatever means necessary. And what he was saying, again, is he's speaking about self-defense. He's not talking about being violent to be violent. He's talking about violence where necessary when provoked. Now, in speaking like this, it doesn't mean that we're anti-white, but it does mean that we're anti-exploitation, we're anti-degradation, and we're anti-oppression. So often, I think the Black Power movement and people like Malcolm X are categorized as anti-white. And the reality is there was, as I mentioned last week, a growing concern that white activists and white supporters did not give their full support, that they didn't understand what African Americans were going through, and they could only vaguely sympathize and not really comprehend it, so they weren't as dedicated to the cause as African American activists. I think when you look from that perspective, you can understand their concerns, but that is not in any way to say that they're anti-white. We're going to talk about the Black Panther movement by the end of this lecture, and they recognized a lot of issues in social class. So, in 1965, Malcolm is assassinated while speaking at an OAAU rally in Harlem. 3 members of the Nation Islam are later convicted, despite the fact that the assailant apprehended at the scene. Talmadge Haver insisted that his 2 co-defendants are innocent. 6 days later, actor Ossie Davis leads the funeral services for Malcolm X. 1,500 people attend. He is buried at Fen Cliff Cemetery in Hartsdale, New York. Later that year, the autobiography of Malcolm X is published, and Betty Shabazz, who was pregnant at the time of Malcolm's murder, gives birth to his last 2 daughters. One thing that I am going to note really quickly, the autobiography of Malcolm X is an incredible read. If you've never read it, it's a riveting story. That being said, most historians have disproved several areas of it, and like I said, if you're interested in learning more about Malcolm X, please let me know, and I'll be happy to provide some recommendations for books on him. Both the autobiography, but also some books where historians have gone back and studied his life. So, as I said, the last thing I'm going to kind of discuss here is the Black Panther movement, because I think symbolically they're probably one of the most well-known Black Power movements, and in my opinion, they're one of the most often incorrectly misinformed Black Power movements. They're usually thought of in really negative terms, and the reality is they did a lot of good things for not only the Black community, but for the working class community, for kind of urban inner city environments. So the Black Panthers, they're founded in 1966, founded originally by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. The first 6 members of the Black Panthers include Albert Big Man Howard, Sherman Fort, Reggie Fort, Little Bobby Hutton, and Newton and Seale. So much like when I talked about Alcatraz, I would prefer one thing that's fabulous, especially when we get into these more recent ideas historically are primary documents. And I want you to go back and read in their own words what they stood for. So this is the Black Panthers Party for Self-Defense, which is what they're often called, shortened as Black Panther Party or Black Panthers. Their 10-point program and what they said that they were advocating for. We want freedom. We want power to determine the destiny of our black community. We believe that black people will not be free until we're able to determine our own destiny. We want full employment for our people. We believe the federal government is responsible and obligated to give every man employment or guaranteed income. We believe that if white American businessmen will not give full employment, then the means of production should be taken from the businessman and placed in the community so that people of the community can organize and employ all of its people and give a high standard of living. We want an end to robbery by the capitalists of our black community. We believe that this racist government has robbed us, and now we are demanding the overdue debt of 40 acres and 2 mules. 40 acres and 2 mules was promised 100 years ago as restitution for slave labor and mass murder of black people. We will accept payment in currency, which will be distributed to our many communities. The Germans are now aiding the Jews in Israel for the genocide of the Jewish people. The Germans murdered 6 million Jews. The American racist has taken part in the slaughter of over 50 million black people. Therefore, we feel that this is a modest demand that we make. We want decent housing, fit for the shelter of human beings. We believe that the white landlords will not give decent housing to our black communities. Then the housing and the land should be made in cooperative with so that our community with the government can build and make decent housing for its people. We want education for our people that exposes the true nature of this decadent American society. We want education that teaches our true history and our role in present-day society. We believe in an education system that will give people a knowledge of our role in present-day society. We believe in an education system that will give people a knowledge of self. If a man does not have knowledge of himself, a man does not have and his position in society and the world, then he has little chance to relate to anything. We want all black men to be exempt from military service. We believe that black people should not be forced to fight in the military service to defend a racist government that does not protect us. We will not fight and kill people of color of the world who, like black people, have been victimized by white racist governments of America. We will protect ourselves from the force and violence of racist police and racist military by whatever means necessary. We want an immediate end to police brutality and the murder of black people. We believe we can end police brutality in our black communities by organizing black self-defense groups that are dedicated to defending our black community from the racist police oppression and brutality. The United States gives a right to bear arms. We therefore believe all black Americans should arm themselves for self-defense. We want freedom from all black men held in federal, state, county, and city prisons and jails. We believe that black Americans should be released from many jails and prisons because they have not received a fair and impartial trial. We want all black people, when brought to trial, to be tried in court by a jury of their peers or people from their black community as defined by the Constitution of the United States. We believe that courts should follow the United States Constitution so that black people will receive fair trials. The 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution gives a man a right to be tried by his peer group. A peer is a person from a similar economic, social, religious, geographical, environmental, and historical and racial background. To do this, the court will be forced to select a jury from the black community from which the black defendant came. We have been and are being tried by all white juries and have no understanding of the average reasoning man of the black community. We want land, bread, housing, education, clothing, justice, and peace. And as our major political objective, a United Nations supervised plebiscite to be held throughout the black colony in which any black colonial subjects will be allowed to participate for the purpose of determining the will of the black people to their national destiny. And I realize that the words here that I'm saying to you are really radical, and I'm not denying the radical nature of the Black Panther movement. But what I want to point out, first of all, is that while there's an emphasis on black people, there's also an emphasis on socialist and communist ideas. And there's a lens of the working class that the Black Panther Party works through. And they did many things for working class whites just like they did for working class blacks. That was an important part of their statement. And as I mentioned, there's clearly issues with police brutality. They believed that they needed to be armed in self-defense against not only other people, but even the police. So the Black Panthers emphasized several ideas like socialism, black nationalism, black power, and class unity. They established patrols in black communities to monitor police activities and protect the residents from police brutality. They welcomed alliances with white activists such as the Students for a Democratic Society and later the Weathermen because they believed that all revolutionaries who wanted to change U.S. society should unite across racial boundaries, across racial lines. The Black Panther Party grew throughout the late 1960s and eventually had chapters all around the country. As racial tensions increased across the country, the Federal Bureau of Investigation blamed the Black Panthers for riots and other incidents of violence. They developed programs that helped provide free breakfast for inner city children, established medical clinics, helped the homeless find housing, and gave away clothing and food drives. So I think that's really important because I think they're often thought of as kind of this angry, defensive, or even aggressive party, but the reality is one of their main bases was community service, and to give back to the community what they felt, the community was missing. Elaine Brown and others take over the leadership in the 1970s, and they continue the idea of community service projects. In fact, some argue that in the 1970s, as women rise to power in the Black Power movement and the Black Panther movement, it becomes even more focused on the idea of community service. And another thing I want to emphasize is the idea that there's no necessary enmity, anger towards nonviolent groups. They often worked with groups like SNCC, and they mourned Martin Luther King's assassination. In fact, one person was quoted as saying, "They had killed our last chance for me to be peaceful with them. They had killed their last chance for negotiation." And that was their response to Martin Luther King's assassination. So I think that probably the best word for the Black Panther movement and other Black Power movements is frustration. They didn't feel like nonviolence was the way to get an answer. They didn't feel like nonviolence necessarily addressed all the issues, and they had concerns about protecting their own families and loved ones. And they believed, like SNCC does, that a more radical move is what's necessary. So, my conclusion this week. What I want to start with is history is a complex set of ideas. I know that recently the Black Panthers have been mentioned a lot in the news. And there's many iconic photos of them holding guns and standing on the courthouse steps. The Black Panthers and the Black Power movement are so much more complex than that image tells us. As I said, they do community service, and they unite across race lines. And whether you agree with their politics or not, their focus is much more communist and socialist than it is actually against and an anti-white. Their anti-white statements usually involve colonialism and oppression and exploitation, much like Malcolm X. So, in self-defense, especially not being nonviolent, complicated word, but not being nonviolent did not usually mean being violent. What it meant was arguing for armed self-defense. And some nonviolent leaders in their private lives believed in armed self-defense to protect themselves from white repercussions for what they were doing. They just felt that the best way to get the public's attention was nonviolent resistance. And the movements often work together. We have this idea that there was the civil rights movement, and then there was Black Power, and they're kind of these separate ideas, but the reality is they're not. They're kind of not even phases, they're very united, but they're, the Black Power movement grows out of a continuing frustration that there's not enough change coming from nonviolent protest, that there needs to be a more radical solution. So this is my final reference slide for week 7. I hope that you guys will check out some of my resources, and like I said, if you're interested further in any of these topics, please let me know. I can recommend some great historiographies and monographs on any of these topics. Thanks, guys. Have a great week.